In the late 1980s, the world believed Japan had cracked the code of history. While America argued with inflation, while Europe struggled with stagnation, Japan was doing something no nation had ever done before. It was growing rich, fast, without chaos, without revolution, without war. Neon lights burned through the Tokyo night. Bullet trains cut through mountains like scalpels. Factories ran with robotic precision. Bankers whispered a dangerous sentence in boardrooms from New York to London. Japan is unstoppable. Books were written predicting the end of American dominance. Business schools taught the Japanese model as the future of capitalism itself. Hollywood villains were Japanese executives buying American landmarks. At its peak, the land beneath the Imperial Palace in Tokyo was said to be worth more than all the real estate in California. And yet, just a few years later, that miracle would collapse into silence. Banks would freeze, careers would vanish, an entire generation would grow old waiting for a recovery that never truly came. Japan would enter a period so long, so quiet, and so painful that history would give it a name: the Lost Decade. This is the story of how Japan didn't fall because of invasion or disaster or revolution, but because it believed its own success story too deeply. The ashes of defeat. To understand Japan's collapse, we must begin with its rebirth. In 1945, Japan was finished. Its cities were flattened. Its empire was gone. Hiroshima and Nagasaki were radioactive scars on human history. The nation was occupied, humiliated, and starving. No one believed Japan would rise again, least of all the Japanese themselves. But something unusual happened in the ruins. Instead of clinging to the past, Japan erased it. The military was dismantled, the old elites were sidelined, a new constitution was written, and with American protection guaranteeing security, Japan made a radical choice. It would never again seek power through conquest. It would seek power through production. Factories replaced battleships, engineers replaced generals. Discipline, education, and coordination became national weapons. The Ministry of International Trade and Industry, IMTI, quietly guided capital into strategic industries, steel, cars, electronics, and it worked. By the 1960s, Japan was exporting televisions. By the 1970s, it was exporting cars. By the 1980s, it was exporting fear. The economic miracle. Japan's growth was not normal growth, it was relentless. Companies reinvested profits instead of paying dividends. Workers stayed loyal to firms for life. Banks funneled cheap credit into industry. Savings rates were enormous. Consumption was modest. Expansion was everything. The result was a machine that never slept. Toyota perfected just-in-time manufacturing. Sony reshaped global electronics. Japanese products became symbols of quality and efficiency. Meanwhile, America deindustrialized, Britain stagnated, and Japan surged forward. By 1985, Japan had become the second largest economy on Earth, and that's when the world blinked. The Plaza Accord, the first crack. Success creates enemies, but it also creates pressure. By the mid-1980s, America was angry. The U.S. was running massive trade deficits with Japan. American factories were closing. Politicians demanded action. And in 1985, 5 nations met at New York's Plaza Hotel to force a solution: the Plaza Accord. Its goal was simple: weaken the U.S. dollar and strengthen the Japanese yen. On paper, this was cooperation. In reality, it was a shockwave. The yen soared. Almost overnight, Japanese exports became more expensive. The very engine that had powered Japan's miracle was suddenly under threat. Factories panicked, politicians feared recession, and the Bank of Japan made a decision that would haunt the nation for decades. They turned on the money tap. Cheap money, dangerous confidence. To offset the rising yen, Japan slashed interest rates. Credit became abundant, loans became easy, risk disappeared, or so it seemed. Banks lent not based on productivity, but on collateral.
and the most valuable collateral in Japan was land. Land in Japan wasn't just property, it was belief. The belief that land prices never fall, the belief that Japan was special, the belief that tomorrow would always be richer than today. Money poured into real estate, then into stocks, then into speculation layered on speculation. Companies stopped caring about profits, they cared about asset prices. Executives bragged about paper wealth. Banks competed to lend more, faster, bigger. Regulators looked away. Everyone was winning. And when everyone is winning, no one wants to ask why. Tokyo, the capital of excess. By the late 1980s, Tokyo was no longer a city. It was a hallucination. Office buildings were traded like gold bars. Golf club memberships cost more than houses. Companies borrowed against rising land values to buy more land, which raised prices further, which justified more borrowing. The Nikkei index exploded upward. Every night, televisions reported new records. Magazines celebrated young millionaires. Students studied finance instead of engineering. Why build when you could speculate? Japan had not just become rich, it had become certain. Certain that history bent in its favor. Certain that decline was for other nations. Certain that rules no longer applied. And certainty in economics is lethal. The peak. On December 29, 1989, the Nikkei closed at nearly 39,000 points. That was the peak. No bells rang, no alarms sounded, no one noticed, because bubbles don't announce themselves. They whisper reassurance right until the moment they burst. Closing of Part 1, Cliffhanger. As the 1990s dawned, Japan stood taller than ever. Its banks were the largest in the world. Its corporations were global titans. Its citizens believed the future belonged to them. But beneath the neon lights, the foundations were cracking. Interest rates would rise, asset prices would fall, and the miracle would turn into a maze with no exit. In the next part, we will watch Japan do something even more dangerous than speculation. It would refuse to admit it was wrong. In early 1990, nothing looked wrong. Tokyo's streets were still glowing, office towers were still full, newspapers still spoke the language of confidence, but markets move faster than people, and beneath the surface, the air had changed. The Bank of Japan had begun to worry. They saw land prices rising faster than logic. They saw banks lending without restraint. They saw speculation replacing production. And quietly, without drama, they did the one thing that ends every bubble. They raised interest rates. At first, nothing happened. Then stocks hesitated. Then they slipped. Then they fell. And once they started falling, they did not stop. The Nikkei collapse. The Nikkei index, which had climbed for years as if gravity didn't exist, began its descent. Day after day, red numbers replaced green. Traders reassured themselves. Corrections were normal. Japan was strong. This was healthy. But by the end of 1990, the Nikkei had lost nearly half its value. Half. Trillions of dollars in paper wealth evaporated, not because of war, not because of disaster, but because belief had changed. The future was no longer guaranteed. For the first time in decades, Japanese investors experienced a feeling they had forgotten: fear. Land without value. Stocks falling was painful. Land falling was catastrophic. In Japan, land was everything. Banks lent against it. Companies borrowed against it. Families saved through it. Entire balance sheets were built on the assumption that land prices only moved one way, up. But now, districts in Tokyo that once sold for unimaginable prices began to stagnate, then decline, then collapse. A building bought for a fortune was suddenly less than the loan used to buy it. And this created something far more dangerous than losses. It created insolvency. Zombie banks are born. Japanese banks faced a nightmare. Their assets, loans secured by land and stocks, were rotting. But if they acknowledged the losses, they would collapse. So they made a choice that seemed reasonable at the time. They pretended nothing was wrong. Bad loans were rolled over. Interest was deferred. Failing companies were kept alive with new credit, not because they were productive, but because admitting failure would expose the system. Thus, the zombie was born. Zombie banks, zombie companies, an economy that moved but did not live. Credit flowed, but it flowed to the past, not the future. The government's fatal hesitation. This was the moment for decisive action. The government could have forced banks to write off losses. It could have recapitalized them quickly. It could have allowed weak firms to fail so stronger ones could grow. Instead, it hesitated. Japanese culture prized harmony over confrontation. Failure carried deep shame. No politician wanted to be responsible for collapse. No banker wanted to admit mistakes. So the crisis was stretched. Months became years, years became decades, and the longer Japan waited, the worse the
To be continue. I am Join. This is Cinematic History. Please like and subscribe.